It's great to be joining the Twin Cities Creation Science Association group tonight, and been talking with Brian and Ross and others that have been helping out technically to get ready, and just a blessing and a privilege to be part of this time together of presenting the origin of asteroids, comets, trans-neptunian objects based on the hydroplate theory, but also giving some other background of what comets, asteroids, and TNOs are. And I just wanted to say that it reminds me, Lake Placid, the place of the 1980 election, Miracle on Ice, or 1980 Olympics, Miracle on Ice. My wife and I yesterday were having a Valentine's lunch, and in the restaurant they had the ice hockey going, and we started looking up for when we were stationed in New York near Lake Placid with the nuclear Navy at the time, and we started looking at it, and we go, oh, there's a new movie out that we'd never seen, Kurt Russell, and then in the movie we realized, oh, Herb Brooks is from Twin Cities area, just north of you guys. And so that was kind of made this a little special to have the blessing of the history of that phenomenal coach that caused the Miracle on Ice there in 1980. So with that, I just wanted to start out by saying this is a time for me to just share with you how God used Dr. Walt Brown hydroplate theory in my life, because when I got saved in 1974, I instantly dropped the evolution dogma. And because I read Genesis 1, that God created the heavens and the earth and everything in it, blew the breath of life into man, piled up the dirt and blew the breath of life into man. And I knew at that moment it was true, because I was radically saved from being an unbeliever. But I really had a struggle with the flood of Noah. When I got to that part, how in the world did this whole world get flooded to 21.5 feet at one time? And yet I knew there was evidence for it, because even as a non-believer in high school, Arapahoe High School in Littleton, Colorado, and was on a field trip with the school doing topo maps of the Red Rocks amphitheater area, I personally, kicked over a rock and saw a seashell fossil. And I go, wow, we're higher than the Mile Hill city of Denver. And how did this place ever get underwater? But it was. I knew it was at one time underwater. I shared with a friend of mine, Kent Curry, who might even be zooming in with us today. He was on, he and I were both in the nuclear Navy. And I said to him, if you ever hear anything that gives a compelling evidence for creation in the flood, then let me know. And so years later, when we're both out of the Navy serving as civilians in our different professions, he said, hey, Kevin, I found a book. It was an earlier edition of Dr. Walt Brown's book, In the Beginning, Compelling Evidence for Creation in the Flood, which is at creationscience.com online book. The 9th edition is in the editorial process right now, preparing it for printing as we speak. The 8th edition is sold out, but you can buy it for about $100 used online. And I realized at that point, I just, wow, this makes so much sense. And ever since then, 25 years later, everything that I've learned about our planet and the solar system is consistent with Dr. Brown's theory of the hydroplate, the hydroplate theory explanation for the flood, which we're going to get into towards the end of our time today, as I'll explain later. But first, we want to give the resources for what I'm going to be presenting here, which is, again, Dr. Brown's work. And then Brian Nickel did some of the animations that I have, that I'm using here. And Brian Nickel, I saw that he is part of the Zoom today, and a big thank you to Brian. And you can get his YouTube channel on YouTube, or you can also see it on Rumble. And he's put together hundreds and hundreds of man hours of animations that simplify by what you can see instead of read the hydroplate theory very accurately. Brian Nickel is a mechanical engineer, used to work for Raytheon. Now he's an inventor and engineer in Montana. And also Mike Snavely, he provided a short clip from his video, Horrors of the Flood. And you want to get Horrors of the Flood version 2, which has just recently become available. It has an updated animation, including what we're going to be seeing today. And his website is missionimperative.org. And so some of the statements that I'm going to be making here are going to be based on college level orbital physics, and I'm not going to have the time to explain it. So I'm going to ask you to just kind of trust me for now. And I'm going to start with a background related to Dr. Brownlee, not Dr. Brown, but Dr. Brownlee of the University of Washington, astronomy professor who was the principal investigator of the Stardust space probe program that we'll be talking about. So the sequence of events are going to be defining what comets, asteroids are, then getting into what Dr. Brownlee's Stardust space probe and what they found compared to what they thought they were going to find. And then looking at, well, if he's wrong about the origin of these things, that can we know when they came into existence? Some people, some young Earth creationists think that comets, asteroids, TNOs were invented during the creation week and just not listed. I'm going to make a case that can't be true. And so then if that's not the case, then where did they come from? The answer will be the hydroplate theory that we're going to get into. And then my detailed, or some of my discussion with Dr. Brownlee is going to close out the session with the final prophecies of 2 Peter chapter 3 that apply to our day and why we're here and doing this. My mission is that everybody here would be able to, one, look up in the sky when a comet comes by, or if one comes by again, and just stand in awe that those comets and even asteroids were jettisoned from this earth during the flood of Noah, and they're coming back. Some of them are going to be coming back to earth for judgment, and to increase our faith in God's word being true, that evolution and the Big Bang cannot explain our solar system or a life on earth. But what can explain it is the Bible, where it says, in the beginning, God created. A few chapters later, and then the world that then was destroyed by a flood that had greater cataclysms than most people realize, because some of that went up into space, as we're going to discuss. So what are comets? They're floating debris piles that have been loosely tied together in space, that when they get close to the sun, they give a comet tail, which is a result of the gases being given off as it gets close to the sun. The gases volatilize and push off some of the debris from the head of the comet, giving comet tails. Asteroids are similar to comets, except they've run out of gases, volatiles, to give off when they get close to the sun, so they don't give anything off. They're called asteroids. This particular picture is called Itokawa. And then TNOs are trans-neptunian objects, meaning objects that are orbiting in our solar system outside, further away from the sun than the planet Neptune. So trans-neptunian objects, which can go out much further than Neptune, and Pluto being one of them, as we'll see. So again, what are comets? This is a dictionary, evolutionary mindset dictionary view, but not too far off. It's a celestial object consisting of a nucleus of ice and dust, and when near the sun, a tail of gas and dust particles pointing away from the sun. Comet tail forms as it nears the sun. So in this picture, the white is the comet, and it's going in an elliptical orbit counterclockwise in this diagram, counterclockwise. And when it gets up to the very top, that's called aphelion, the furthest place from the sun. And when it's there, it's only going at walking speed. And then finally, the sun's gravity, after it tried to escape the sun's gravity, it then stops its velocity away from the sun and starts bringing its path back to the sun. And when it gets close enough to the sun to volatilize either gases, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, water, whatever's on the comet, volatilize it, then it grows a tail. And that becomes important for what we're about to get into with Stardust, because the Stardust space probe went to go fly through a tail to collect some of the debris from the comet. Instead of landing on a comet, grabbing debris and coming back, it actually just got the comet debris, the comet material from the tail of the comet. And so the tail always radiates away from the sun because the solar wind from the sun, it's not like wind like we have on Earth, but there's the solar radiation causes any particles to be blown away from the sun. And that's why the tail always points away from the sun. Now, this is a picture of the asteroids, and people are shocked when I show this at our church. They were shocked that each one of those white dots and the green dots at the Trojans and Greeks and the Hildas that are kind of orange dots, those are all asteroids, known asteroids. There's about 1 to 2 million asteroids greater than 0.6 miles in diameter found in the asteroid belt. And the asteroid belt is between Mars and Jupiter, and there's a reason why that's where the asteroids have camped out. That's explained by the hydroplate theory. Big bangers have a very hard time coming up with how did all the asteroids get into the asteroid belt, and they debate it. Their theories are very debatable in-house because each one of their premises based on the Big Bang have serious problems that cause people to come up with many different theories. The hydroplate theory has no problem explaining why that asteroid belt is there, and especially why the green areas of asteroids, the Greeks and the Trojans, are there, which is really baffling. And I can't get into the specifics about that, but there's gravity wells in the path of Jupiter. And so those asteroids are traveling at just a little bit ahead of Jupiter and a little bit behind Jupiter by Lagrange points is what they're called, but we can't get into that. And others are in elliptical orbits around the sun and cross the orbital path of the planet. So if these asteroids in the asteroid belt stayed there, then they would not be a threat to the Earth. But there can be collisions within the asteroid belt that alters the path of asteroids, and they then become, in a way, meteors that head towards Earth. And there's already, we know right now, there are some asteroids not in the asteroid belt that are circling the Earth and orbiting in planes that can run into the planets, including Earth. And then trans-neptunian objects, as I said before, are objects that are out past Neptune. And you can see in the Pluto orbit that Pluto, for some of the time, is a trans-Neptunian object when it's in its circular orbit around its elliptical orbit around the sun. And sometimes semi-minor axis puts it inside the Neptune orbit. So Pluto is, and actually astronomers think today that Pluto is a combination of millions of comets. And it is believed by the hydroplate theory that the mass and the gases, all the mass of Pluto are a result of being ejected from the Earth and sent into orbit, in an elliptical orbit that has placed it outside into the Kuiper belt at times, and sometimes inside of that. The details of that are in Dr. Brown's chapter in his book about Pluto. We won't have time to get into the reasons for it, but the space probe that went by and took pictures of Pluto, shocking to the Big Bangers about what they found, not shocking to the hydroplate theory. So 70,000 trans-Neptunian objects greater than 0.6 miles in diameter, greater than 30 AU. And an AU is the astronomical unit, which means the distance between the sun and the Earth, about 93 million miles. So Neptune is 30 times 93 million miles away from the Earth in its orbit around the sun. So where do they come from? Does the Bible give us any clues of where comets, asteroids, TNOs come from, and what do evolutionists say? And I'm going to start with what evolutionists say by going to Dr. Brownlee of the University of Washington. And so he was the principal investigator for a $212 million Stardust space probe mission. The mission of Stardust space probe was to go to it's spelled wild too, but it's a German name. So it's Wild 2. It went to the Wild 2 comet, and this is a picture that was actually taken by the space probe. As it was going by, the mothership took the space probe took a picture and sent it back to Earth. This is a picture of the head of the Wild 2 comet, and that's a picture of Dr. Brownlee. The Stardust probe successfully flew through the Wild 2 comet tail to collect comet material and return it to Earth on January 15, 2006. And it really was a phenomenal feat to do that. And at the time, it traveled the greatest distance, 3 billion miles, because they had to get 2 gravity boosts from the sun and gravity boost from the Earth to get it going fast enough to go catch up with the comet. And then 2 years later, bring back the debris that they knew they caught some. That, you know, the space probe opens up its look at it like you open up the trash can lid, and then you scoop the stuff from the comet tail dust into your trash can, which in this case is exotic material called aerogel, to catch the material, and then close the lid and send the trash can back to Earth and open it up in a clean room and find out what was the material collected from the Wild 2 comet. So where did Dr. Brownlee think the comets came from? And this is, I'm quoting now from his article, 3 years after they opened up the space probe, after 3.5 years after the space probe landed, and they took it to the clean room, opened it up, found all the surprises, and then 3 years later, he puts together this 2-page executive summary about the mission, a mission with many scientific surprises. Comets are ancient bodies of frozen ice and dust that form beyond the orbit of the most distant planet. They were expected to contain materials that the solar system formed from, preserved in ice for billions of years. We expected, based on the Big Bang, that we were going to find XYZ. And, based on solar dust and interstellar dust. When the international team of 200 scientists began examining the return particles, when they opened up the probe in the clean room, and they scooped out all the debris that was caught in the aerogel, they sent it to 200 different labs across the world. And those international teams of 200 scientists began examining of the return particles. We found that the particles were indeed ancient building blocks of the solar system, but the nature and origin of the particles was quite unexpected. What we found was remarkable. Instead of rocky materials that formed around previous generations of stars, we found that most of the comet's rocky matter formed inside our solar system at extremely high temperature. Now we have to understand that they knew that, their premise is, hey, everything's out there in the near absolute zero cold of space. So, and then they weren't expecting to find minerals, crystalline minerals that only form greater than 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And how is it possible that a comet has minerals greater than 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit? He goes on to say it was very exciting to find pieces of chondrules and I'm adding with olivine, because chondrules do contain olivine sometimes, because they found a bunch of olivine also in the comet, and the scientific implications of this are profound. When we first presented the discovery, you could see jaws drop in the room crowded with 600 scientists. It was just phenomenal to discover something this profound. And so, in other words, the Big Bangers had their idea of how comets, asteroids, TNOs happened or came to be. And it was all based on leftovers from the time and chance creation of planets, stars, suns, supernovas, black holes, everything else. And all of the theories were absolutely shattered by the results of this program, of this space probe catching the comet tail dust. And they were surprised, couldn't explain it. And I'm saying that based on my personal conversation with Dr. Brownlee, where he admitted some of the shock, including the finding that inner solar system materials formed at very high temperature were transported all the way to the edge of the solar system to the region where Pluto is one of the major scientific findings of Stardust. But Dr. Brownlee can't explain how, but the hydroplate theory can say. Where did 1,000+ degrees Fahrenheit temperature create crystalline materials that were then jettisoned from the inner solar system into the outer solar system, and then you scoop it up, and when you go to sample as comet tail dust, absolutely easily predicted and expected by the hydroplate theory. And Brownlee also goes on to say in the same summary article, Stardust also had a variety of other surprises. One of the most unexpected was the 2009 discovery of the amino acid glycine by a team of scientists from the Goddard Space Flight Center. Now, glycine is a left-handed amino acid common to all life. It's an amino acid used by all life. And he was shocked, and I can tell you personally, he admitted to me, shocked out of his mind to find glycine in space in his comet tail dust samples. And so he's admitting here in his summary that this was unexpected. How did this get up there? Now, and we're all familiar, for those that listen now to astronomers, they go, oh, life was formed on Earth by comets delivering the building blocks, the amino acids for the building blocks of life to Earth. But that begs the question, if we have a hard enough time for scientists to come up with how life came to be on the life planet Earth under perfect conditions, how in the world could life have been how could the amino acids have been formed in the vacuum and near absolute zero temperature of space? So they of course are shocked, but they don't have an answer for it. He admitted to me in a phone call on August 18, 2009, that he was shocked by this discovery, and we'll talk more about that towards the end of this presentation. So, and I happen to notice and already have texted Dee that she is now a Twin City resident, is with us in this Zoom session. And at the time of the Stardust Space Program project, she was invited as a NASA ambassador, nasa.gov. She's listed as an ambassador, as a school teacher who's an ambassador for the space program. She had the privilege of being invited by Dr. Brownlee to be with him during the clean room analysis of the debris that was brought back. She's a student of Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory and was with him in the clean room. 2 days before the space probe landed, Dee wrote Dr. Walt Brown of the hydroplate theory the following: Dr. Don Brownlee of the University of Washington showed me a new instrument that will be used to analyze the particles. He stated that the particles from this comet dust would be pristine material from the formation of the solar system. He also stated that the ions would show that this dust would be very different from material from Earth. This difference was not in the elements, but something to do with the ions. But my simple way of understanding this is that I expect he will pop one of those particles in that expensive machine and find out it is the same stuff we find on Earth. And this will be very shocking and unexpected. These are words I hear often from NASA researchers. So Dee is saying this before they even are shocked and unexpected about the Stardust space probe results, because she's saying she's already heard all this. And I don't know exactly what they were talking about, but we can guess. Like when the first time that NASA saw an asteroid with a moon, and they would have, in fact, when the person finally first said, I think I see a moon around that asteroid, to them, it's shocking, unexpected, impossible, inconceivable that an asteroid could have a moon orbiting, a main asteroid body. What about contact asteroids? Inconceivable. How about contact, meaning not only the moon decided to become part of the mothership. It'd be like if our moon were all of a sudden to come down and slightly contact the Earth, and now there's no longer a moon and an Earth, there's an Earth with a contact moon, and that would be a contact binary asteroid if it's talking about an asteroid and its moon. Why are we seeing in mass spectrometry, why are we seeing olivine? A mineral very common on Earth, but why would it be up in space? So shocking, inconceivable. And on Sunday at the church, when I gave this talk, I said, I don't think that word means what you think it means, is what we as creationists should be saying to these people. Inconceivable, shocking. Yeah, that doesn't mean what you mean, because it's predicted by the hydroplate theory. So D, the hydroplate theory student, was right, and the UW professor, astronomy professor, was wrong, and still is. And then this is, I'd like to just read it like I have been. All evidence from Stardust and other space probes, which I've followed quite closely, not as well as people that it's their life, but I've followed it close enough to make this statement, are consistent with Dr. Brown's premise that comets, asteroids, and TNOs formed inside of our solar system when debris and water was ejected from the Earth during the flood of Noah about 5,000 years ago. And I'll go on to say, and I'm going to say it in a couple of slides, but say it right now. And when I talked to Dr. Brownlee on the phone, the day that I found out that they found glycine, 3 years after the probe landed, they realized that they had found glycine. I made this statement, Dr. Brownlee, everything that we know about comets and asteroids is that they came from the Earth. And he didn't hang up on me. He continued the conversation, and we had a very professional, considerate conversation that I'll get into later. And by the way, I was in the University of Washington presentation by Dr. Brownlee shortly after they opened the probe, with him explaining what was found in the aerogel. And I stood up and asked a question whether or not they found organic molecules, if they found organics, signs of life. And he didn't answer that question directly. And by the way, I'm going to post all of the correspondence for all this is going to get posted with this Zoom recording. And you'll be able to read the details of all this. But it would later on, he knew shortly after this, he knew that people were finding glycine, but then they got accused, NASA and Dr. Brownlee got accused of somehow allowing the space probe to get contaminated because there's no way they could find glycine on the space probe. And after years of just verifying that there is no way this was contaminated, they went public with their discovery of glycine. So what does this Bible say that could shed light on the origin of comets, asteroids, and TNOs? And how can the hydroplate theory explain them? As we're going to go, later on, we're going to bring in the hydroplate theory. But for now, what does the Bible say? And I'm going to spend the next few minutes making a case for the fact that the Bible makes it perfectly clear that asteroids and comets and TNOs could not have been part of the original creation. So that's what I'm going to be. That's the premise I'm giving in the next few slides. Because in Genesis 1:14-19, on the fourth day of creation, it said, and I'll just skip to the part, and God saw that it was good. I created the sun, the moon, the stars for signs and seasons, for days and years, and it was good. No mention of comets and asteroids. But just because it doesn't mention them doesn't mean that they couldn't have been created there if that's all we had to worry about. But we've had asteroids, which can become meteors. We've even had comets that hit the Earth, leveled, thousands of square miles of forest land in Russia, in the Siberian forest, back at the turn of the last century. But recently, in fact, if you look at this, the date stamp on this picture, it was exactly 9 years ago that Russia experienced a not seen before it arrived meteor called the Chelyabinsk meteor, which shattered thousands of windows, partially destroyed buildings. 7,200 buildings were damaged in 6 cities. 1,500 people were injured. And most of the people injured, maybe not most, but many of the people injured was because they saw the flash in the sky and they went to the windows of their offices, buildings, houses. What is going on? What's that flash? And by the time they got to the window, the shock wave came and blew the glass into their face. And so this is kind of a public service announcement. If you ever see a flash, it could be a meteor or a nuke bomb going off, and you don't want to run to the window to go see what it is because the shock wave could be coming. So they didn't see this meteor coming. And because of fear that an extinction level asteroid could be on the way to hit Earth, billions of dollars are being spent to detect and deflect one before it does. And the way they're spending the billions of dollars is one in software programming, which they just came out with a new software program that is, using AI and supercomputer capabilities to take those millions of asteroids and have the computer with AI figure out where all those asteroids are going to be. If one's going to get a collision, and if it does have a collision, what could change the orbit, doing all that because you have to do 2 things to keep a meteor, an extinction level meteor, from hitting the Earth. You have to know that it's coming, and you have to know it soon enough that you can send some spacecraft up to do something. And they're talking about nuking it or giving it a nudge or crashing into it. They're coming up with all these theories of the best way to get rid of an incoming asteroid. And then you have to send the space probe. And so they're using software programs, telescopes. The new Webb telescope that just got into orbit at the L1 Lagrange point is soon going to be giving data that we've never seen before. It's a replacement for the other space telescope that we've been using for decades. So one just took off, one of the space probes to do a diversion of an asteroid test was launched November 24th last year. And the purpose of the DART mission is to deflect an asteroid. They're trying to learn how to deflect one that would come in. Impact is with the asteroid is going to be September 26, 2022. You can watch an animation of it on YouTube, which we're going to watch right now. You should be able to hear this. So this is an asteroid with a moon. This is one of those binary asteroids that are shocking to the evolutionary big bangers. One spacecraft crashes into it. The other one takes a picture while it happens. And the purpose of the mission is to deflect the moon of the asteroid so that it goes into a closer orbit with the asteroid, changing the angular momentum of the binary asteroid. And so even though you're only hitting the moon because of the laws of conservation of angular momentum, it's actually going to cause both of them to change their orbit and deflect it. And so the idea is if you can get to an asteroid soon enough and deflect it enough, an asteroid that was going to hit the Earth can be repositioned to just barely miss the Earth. That's the plan of that mission. So once again, the 6th day, after all of creation is done, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So how can it be very good that there's 26,115 asteroids that pass near Earth according to the NASA database? And some of those asteroids become meteors and have hit planet Earth before. Big crater in Arizona. Anybody that was anywhere near that when it hit, however many hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, would have been killed. How can that be good? And besides that, there's also prophecies of meteors, asteroids, possibly comets hitting the earth in the future. The second angel in the book of Revelation, during the trumpet judgments in the book of Revelation, chapter 8, the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So there's going to be an asteroid comet that hits the ocean and it's going to destroy. We don't know which sea it's talking about. We don't know if it's a Mediterranean Sea or the Indian Ocean Sea. We don't know which one it's talking about. Then right after that, then a third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, describing what happens when meteors come in, like we saw in the earlier slide over Chernobyl, over Russia. And it fell in a third of the rivers and the springs of water. And the name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. So the coming judgment of God upon this earth, as recorded in the book of Revelation, is using meteors, apparently, that have Earth's name on them right now, and they're out there somewhere. And it's possible that the reason why the governments have really ramped up their desire to find it is because maybe they know there's one. And in fact, they know till very recently, they thought there was one that was actually going to hit us. But now that they've had more time to study the orbit, they think it's going to miss us by 20,000 miles, which is like, that's like somebody shooting at you with a rifle and from 1,000 yards away, and they're saying, I'm going to miss you because all it's going to do is hit the hair on your head. Asteroid Apophis will barely miss Earth on April 13th, 2029. This thing is really coming on that day. And it's 1,100 feet in diameter. It'll be traveling about 40,000 miles an hour. And the meteor that blew up over Russia, that was half a megaton bombs worth of energy was released, that did all that damage. It was only 56 feet in diameter. So this was multiple times greater diameter, more mass. And the geocentric satellites are 22,236 miles. The satellites that are staying over one place on the Earth for weather satellites and communications, some communications, etc., they travel higher up than this asteroid's coming. So the asteroid could take out some of these satellites. If it were to hit, the energy released is estimated by NASA will be 1,101 megaton bombs. And the ones that blew up in Japan were like 40 kilotons. And a megaton is 1,000,000 tons. Kilotons are thousands of tons. And so I couldn't say a 1,000 megaton bomb because there's never been a 1,000 megaton bomb. Man can't make a bomb that big. So there'll be sign in the suns and the moon. This is out of Luke. This is Jesus speaking. There will be signs in the sun and the moon in the last days, and in the stars on the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from the fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. So I teach, I believe, I could be wrong, that this prophecy from Jesus is saying that man will be told there's an asteroid coming. It's not going to miss us by 2,000 miles. It's going to hit us. And we know what day it's going to hit. And it could be months, years away from when we get told. We know when it's going to hit. We know where it's going to hit the earth. And there's nothing you can do about it. Everybody on this, in that state, anybody in that country is going to die. And their hearts will fail them from the fear and expectation of that which they've been told is happening, coming their way. So this artist's conception of a tsunami hitting a major city is not overblown for what could be happening in the future. So how can this be good? The French word disaster is where we get disaster. And it's a combination of two words, des meaning bad, and aster meaning star, bad star. Comets have always been viewed by humankind, and I think because of Noah passing down, because Noah would have been able, and his family would have been able to say when they looked up at the night sky, and they would have seen probably dozens of comets for years and years until they started getting dealt with by crashing into the sun or moon or wherever. And they would have said, you know, before the flood, none of those guys were there. Those comets that we're seeing in the sky, they're a result. We don't maybe they didn't understand. We don't know how they got there, but they're a result of the flood of Noah. They're a result of the judgment of God upon this wicked planet. And they're coming back to earth to judge the world again in the final judgment of wicked man upon the earth. And God saw everything that he had made. Indeed, it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Clearly, comets, asteroids are not very good. So could not have been part of the original creation is my pastoral dogma at this point. They could not have been. So if Dr. Brownlee of the UW is wrong, and comets, asteroids weren't part of the Genesis 1 creation, then where did they come from? Does the Bible give us a clue? And my answer, along with Dr. Brown, is an absolute yes. It does give us a clue, because the flood of Noah started when in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, the authors of the Genesis flood, Henry Morris and John Whitcomb, they emphasized the windows of heaven were open, and they assumed the canopy theory, and they taught all of creation science. Creation science was birthed by that book, and all the churches and pastors were teaching the canopy theory. And I think that, well, they now all have abandoned the canopy theory. I think there's another way to look at this scripture, the fountains of the great deep. So there's water, great deep, underneath the crust. And it was broken up on one day. The crust broke and allowed the fountains of the great deep to come up. And the windows of heaven were open to let stuff go up into space and to come back down from space. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So it wasn't all of a sudden we had a bunch of rain clouds globally raining for 40 days, which is thermodynamically impossible. It was a fountain. So you had fountain of water erupting from the waters of the great deep. So the best way to communicate this is by using Mike Snavely's video, just a few minutes of it here. He has over a 1 hour video. I think it's 1 hour and 10 minutes, and I'm taking just 4 minutes or so to show the animation. And it's you can get this video, The Horrors of the Flood, the most catastrophic event in history, from missionimperative.org. We've bought dozens of them for our church, and to pass out it is a phenomenal piece of work by Mike Snavely and his brother John. And so we're going to watch it now.
In our view, the most plausible explanation for this entire flood scenario has been proposed by Dr. Walter Brown. He calls it the hydroplate theory. Let's have Dr. Brown give us a brief overview of his theory.
We can see on our planet many very strange features that can now be linked together and systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an unimaginable amount of explosive energy. This explanation shows how major mountains formed very quickly. It explains our coal, oil, and methane deposits, rapid continental drift, why we find on the ocean floor huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and rivers. The mountains were smaller than today, perhaps 5,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, about half the water that is now in our oceans was originally contained in interconnected subterranean chambers. This water formed a thin spherical shell at least a mile thick, perhaps 60 miles below the surface of the pre-flood Earth. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 2 miles a second. This crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 3 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 60 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of this rupture. All along the globe-encircling crack, fountains of water jetted supersonically into and far above the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day, and it describes these events about 5,000 years ago that we can now tie together scientifically in cause and effect order. Some of the water jetting high above the stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. These sediments trapped and quickly buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record.
Again, all the fountains of the great deep broke up in one day, and the windows of heaven were open. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And there's that video animation, and Walt narrating it continues to go on in Mike's DVD, Mike Snavely's DVD, but I'm just cutting off that part. And he mentioned that the water jettisoned into space as a result of the weight of the crust upon it. Plus, there's also the energy associated with electrical Z-pinch, which I can't get into. There was thermal energy being added as a result of the fluttering of the crust that's going to add energy to send that water up into velocities that allow it to get into orbits around the sun, as we'll see. But one thing I want to make clear, some people have misunderstood the way it's communicated in the past, that the Earth did not spit out comets, asteroids, and TNOs fully formed. It was, that's not what happened. What did happen is the Earth, as we've already seen, along the 40-some thousand mile crack in the crust, was jettisoning water. And when you think about it, as soon as the crack ruptured, it would have spread open a few miles right away just by the stretching of the crust. And everything above that crack, including the atmosphere, at the moment of the crack, all the nitrogen, oxygen in the atmosphere would have been jettisoned up into space, because the original crack had the greatest energy that had stuff being shot up into space. And then it would have been just a conduit, a pipe that would not dealing so much with the atmosphere next to the crack, but that conduit pipe sending debris up into space is rocks and dust and even organic material would have been accelerated from 0 to 25,000 miles an hour, roughly, to escape Earth's gravitational field, which would have turned them into bits and pieces of glycine amino acids and other things. So what I want to emphasize in this slide, I was going to get into more, but there's not time, but I want to emphasize that as the rupture, the waters are moving horizontally underneath the crust to find the rupture location and then be turned vertically up. The crust would have fluttered, and as the crust fluttered, sorry about that. As the crust fluttered, you would have had debris breaking up from underneath the crust, the sealing of the crust. And then the crust tips would have come down towards the mantle, trapping. And then as soon as that would have opened up, it would have been an explosive force sending stuff at greater than 7 miles a second, which sends things into space around orbits around the sun. So here's an example of that pulsed debris field. And it would have just shot out all the atmosphere, water, debris. And as it gets away from the Earth, now the gravity of the Earth is no longer affecting it as much. And the gravity of the different pieces of debris, all traveling in the same direction, all of it with moisture, with water vapor, maybe nitrogen vapor, oxygen vapor, carbon dioxide vapor, turning into dry ice as it gets into the cold of space. But some of it being hit by the sun would have all been going in the same direction, and over time would have come together until it turns into comets, asteroids, TNOs traveling through space. Like, this isn't the Bill 2 comet, this is the 67P comet that was visited by the Rosetta space program. And they were shocked to find out that it is a contact binary comet. It looks like a duck. They called it, looks like a duck, where it has the main body and the head. And those two were at one time separate from each other, but they slowly came together and contacted at the neck. And that's why it's called a contact binary. So they have a hard time explaining that on this comet. There was also, if you were to stick your finger into some soft mud, stick it all the way in and then pull it out, you'd see the walls of that mud hole that you made. Well, there was an impact location on this comet that was photographed by the lander, and they were shocked, inconceivable, to find that in the wall, the vertical walls of that impact crater were thousands and thousands of rounded off, like river rock, rounded off rocks that the astronomers called dinosaur eggs, because they look like dinosaur eggs. Some of them, pretty big, and some of them small, which, here's the sign that Bob Enyart put up. And we really miss Bob Enyart, but he's emphasized this. Walt Brown was here. And we have a saying among the hydroplate theory clientele that all scientists work for Dr. Brown. Instead of creationists having to spend $212 million for a Stardust space probe, we let the government do it. And they go up and they find stuff to support that does support the hydroplate theory. So this gets a little technical, and some of the people in our church didn't like this part. So here's fair warning. But this is laws of physics. And actually, Brian Nickel recently made this for me to try and help communicate it. This cannon is shooting straight up from the Earth, which is what would have happened during the 40-some thousand mile crack in the Earth. It's shooting straight up, and some of the material would have gone up with a velocity that comes back down. That's the 40 days of rainfall. That's just rain coming back down on the Earth. Some of it would have gone higher up and come down. That would have solidified carbon dioxide into dry ice, would have frozen the water, falling in some places on the Earth to bury mammoths, and then the Earth rolled to take those buried mammoths that were in temperate climates and rolled them up into the Arctic Ocean, where they stayed frozen because of being in the tundra. And then some of it goes at greater than 7 miles a second, and it leaves the gravity well of Earth. And I know this could be confusing. It leaves Earth's gravity because Earth no longer can hold on to that item that left at 7 miles a second, and it starts to leave and falls into the sun gravity well of the solar system, and it starts to go in elliptical orbits around the sun. And so here is a typical elliptical orbit of the debris that was shot out from the Earth. And there would have been all kinds of energy. Some of the comets, asteroids, some of the debris fields that became comets and asteroids would have had very little energy and would have stayed inside of our ring of planets. This one is shown to be a long period comet. Some of them would have stayed right inside the solar system, and they're short period comets. Some of them are extremely long, near parabolic orbit comets, like Hale-Bopp. Hale-Bopp that came 25 years ago, is going to come back in thousands of years. So some of them take a long time to do that trek around because they were ejected with so much energy from the Earth. And so there's 1,000 comets with defined orbits, 4,000 more unconfirmed. They're low density, small total mass. There's no new comets have been added to the solar system by any observation that, they tell us the comets came from an Oort cloud that's never been seen. It's a figment of people's imagination because they have to come up with something. And they say that every once in a while, a star or something goes by that Oort cloud and kicks a comet towards Earth. And then somehow, as it comes towards Earth, something slows it down so it can be captured by our sun and turn into a comet. They've never seen it happen, but that's what they say we got all of our comets from. But there's many comets that are killed. And in fact, 10,000 years from now, all the ones that are in Jupiter's family will be destroyed by Jupiter. So that means that they were formed recently, about 5,000 years ago, when they were created at the flood of Noah. And can't spend too much time on this, but here's Jupiter's family. If you look at the bottom scale, that's how far away from the sun the orbits of these comets go. And most of the short period comets are sucked into Jupiter's family because Jupiter, as it goes around, its massive, its mass and therefore associated massive power of gravity, force of gravity, is going to suck the comets into its orbital path over time. And in 10,000 years, every single one of the A comets will be destroyed, all the B comets will be destroyed, and there will be no more, the red bar chart that I just showed you is going to be gone. So, and in fact, this Shoemaker-Levy comet that's up here at the top, that was ripped apart in one orbit around Jupiter, and then the next orbit, all those ripped apart pieces crashed into Jupiter. We watched the death of a comet. So no new comets being added to the solar system, and many are being destroyed by the planets. And so comets were recently produced and were formed at the same time, again, answered by the hydroplate theory and ejection from the Earth at the flood of Noah. And so how come asteroids are different than comets? And how did their orbits, when I said that they're ejected in elliptical orbits with various energies, how did those elliptical orbits turn into circular asteroid belt? And again, watch Brian Nickel YouTube teaching on this and be equipped for some orbital physics. You have to have college level orbital physics to really appreciate the animations that Brian Nickel has put together. So are not part of God's good creation about 6,000 years ago, but they are here now, have impacted the Earth before, and according to the Bible prophecy are going to impact the Earth again. Those who reject biblical creation and the flood manufacture fairy tales in an attempt to explain objects in our solar system. But the biblical Christian can have an answer that is consistent with the Bible and science. And, again, my goal is that everybody here would be equipped or become equipped with the details of Dr. Brown's theory and be able to witness to people that think that the Bible is the fairy tale by telling them, well, if the Bible is a fairy tale, how come the things the Bible says comes true and are predictable, not only on Earth, but in the solar system, but what your scientists say is the truth and what they teach in every college and university and high school for that matter, everything that they teach ends up not being true. So you guys believe a fairy tale, the Bible is the truth. And the Bible has a closing argument that everybody must be born again, that everybody has to come to realize that man did not just get on this planet by time and chance. We were created by a great loving creator to come here to Earth, and sin has separated us from our creator until we get the cure, which is his son, Jesus, which we'll talk about in our concluding. But because I had become a student of the hydroplate theory, I felt fully confident to communicate with Dr. Brownlee of the University of Washington and to basically predict that what he would find was not what he was anticipating, even before they opened up the space probe. So in June of 2004, I sent Dr. Brownlee a package of Dr. Brown's predictions about Mars, which had come true, that they'd find salt water on Mars. He predicted it before they found it, and stated to him in that letter that Stardust probe would bring back material consistent with Dr. Brown's theory, rather than what he, Dr. Brownlee, was expecting. This is 2 years before, or almost 2 years before, he actually is able to open up the probe and determine that that is in fact the case. He did not respond to that letter. And then in 2006, March, after they've opened up the probe, and they found all the shocking results, several news articles were written, like NASA find throws space experts, mineral traces in Stardust samples upset, long-held assumptions about origins of comets, Houston Chronicle. Comet from coldest spot in the solar system has material from hottest places, University of Washington release from the Stardust probe. Celestial dust challenges basic view of comets by the Seattle Times. I talked to Sandy when she wrote this article and told her about that there's an alternate theory that isn't surprised by these. And she goes, oh, what is it? And when I told her it was a creationist view on young Earth creation, she said, oh, never mind. So then this one, which is really amazing. This was by thunderbolts.info. Stardust shatters comet theory, March 2006. This is an incredible statement. Today, the study of comets has reached a crisis. Every key finding comes as a surprise. But no one seems to realize that the surprises are not random. They are predictable under a different perspective. The tragedy is the way inertia can leave well-intentioned scientists with their feet in the sand. The momentum of prior belief, working in concert with pressing demands of funding, creates nearly endless obstructions to open-minded exploration and discourse. Even a brief vacation from an oppressive paradigm could do wonders. So this author, and I don't even know who the author was and what their frame of reference is, but they're saying, hey, you guys say shocking, inconceivable, can't happen, but we found it all the time. So now we can predict that everything you're going to find is different than your, I'm going to add, I don't know what he was thinking, I'm going to add, different than your Big Bang, no creator paradigm. And so that must mean that something's wrong with you and you should get out of your demands of funding and all your obstructions and open up your mind to receive a different paradigm, which is there is a creator and his name is Jesus, and he came to give us life, and there was a flood of judgment that came upon the earth. So going on with my interactions with Dr. Brownlee, I was in the audience when Dr. Brownlee gave a public lecture at the University of Washington about the Stardust findings. He discussed the shocking and unexpected findings of their mission. After the lecture, I talked with Dr. Brownlee, gave him a copy of Dr. Brown's Comet chapter, and the email Dr. Brown sent the day before Stardust probe landed, where he predicted what would be found when they opened the capsule. And his predictions came true. Dr. Brownlee took the material, said he would read it. A couple of weeks later, I called him, and he said that he would not finish reading Dr. Brown's theory because Dr. Brownlee knew that Dr. Brown's theory was not how comets form, because he was stuck in his world still. And hopefully someday, hopefully maybe that'll change. August 18th, 2009, after the news, so this is now 3 years later, and the news has come out that glycine was found, and I had asked him in the University of Washington whether there was evidence of organic molecules. And the summary, I called him, and this was a summary of the phone call. I reminded Dr. Brownlee that I was the one who gave him Dr. Brown's comet chapter and predictions after his lecture at the University of Washington on April 29, 2006. I also said I was the one who asked him the question of whether they had found any organic molecules. He replied they remembered me. I told him the reason that I was calling was because of the recent news that they found the amino acid glycine on Stardust, and wanted to hear from him what he thought. He admitted that he was totally shocked by this discovery. I then reminded him that he had rejected the idea of reading Dr. Brown's work because he knew that Dr. Brown was wrong, and then stated that Dr. Brown's theory on the origin of comets would predict that they would find glycine and other evidence of living matter that had been pulverized into bits and pieces of living building blocks of life. I said that everything that he, Brownlee, and other comet scientists are finding are perfectly consistent with the idea that comets formed as a result of debris that was ejected from the Earth. He didn't balk at this statement and instead let me continue. I then admitted to him that the idea seems preposterous because it is hard to imagine that there was a point in Earth's history where there was an event with enough energy to eject large amounts of crustal material and water from the Earth at escape velocity, but that Dr. Brown's theory included how this event happened and where the energy came from. I then also admitted that Dr. Brown's theory is way outside of the paradigm box that the entire world is sold on, but that he should at least take the time to read Dr. Brown's ideas, even if it was under his bed sheets at night. And I actually literally said that to him. He again treated me with complete respect, listened to the discussion. At the end of our discussion, he asked me to give him Dr. Brown's website address again, because I had given it to him with the stuff that I had left with him. And then I sent 2 more letters that were not answered in February of 2015 and June of 2016. The first one was after the Rosetta program got information about 67P, where they were again shocked. The evolutionists were shocked, but not those who follow the hydroplate theory. And then in June of 2016, when I started seeing all this stuff about spending billions of dollars to go try and find an asteroid with our name on it and do something about it, I said with the increased spending on near-Earth asteroid detection and deflection, he should again consider Dr. Brown's work. Because what we know about asteroids and has a big part of how you go about deflecting it, and he should at least consider Dr. Brown's work. Never heard back from him on those 2 things. So in closing, I want to say that the Bible makes it perfectly clear that it was water that was ejected from below the crust in 2 Peter. And so we know this is true. For this, they willfully forget that by the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished. So the earth that we're standing on was standing out of the water and in the water, and the water that it was standing in, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with that water. So unlike some that think that, again, that Genesis is talking about the fountains of the great deep being ruptured, is all of a sudden catastrophic plate tectonics taken over and seafloor spreading and magma going out on the floor, Peter would kill that idea, does kill that idea. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. And if an asteroid hits the earth, as Revelation predicts it will, it could break up the crust and get a global earthquake going, global volcanic activity. The Bible in Isaiah and in Revelation go on to say that the earth will reel like a top. So it's going to have distribution of mass changes that's going to cause the earth to roll again, like it did when it rolled the mammoths up into the Arctic circles. And every wall is going to fall down. Every island will be removed and every mountain will be moved. Every island will flee away and every mountain will be moved. The earth, and it's quite possible that an asteroid will get that going. get that global runaway earthquake predicted in the Bible going. And so, and if that's the case, the judgment of Noah's day that threw all that debris into space is now ready to create the judgment of the wicked world in the last days. But why is God taking so long? He says in conclusion, but beloved, do not forget that this one thing, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slack concerning his promises, some count slackness, but is long suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. You know, May 18th, 1974, I walked into a Billy Graham movie as a total unbelieving, evolutionary believing, unbelieving of God, evolutionary believing unbeliever. I walked into a Billy Graham movie theater, playing in a theater, and by the end of the 2 hours, I realized I've got to stop fighting this God that loves me. And I guess I could say, well, that day I gave my life to Jesus, never looked back, radically converted from that day. I could have said, well, you know, why don't you just come now? Because God's long suffering for everybody else has come to Jesus since May of 74, and he's left us as ambassadors of his to communicate the Bible's the truth. You don't have to check your brain to be able to believe in science. It's the misunderstanding, the misinterpretation that leads people to believe the falsity that they've evolved and that there was no global flood, no global judgment, even professing Christians that say it was just a local flood in violation of what the clear teaching of Scripture says. And so we have to be united in communicating the truth of what God says to this dying world, because if we believe what the Bible says, we know it will come out to be true when people put enough microscopes onto it and enough telescopes onto it and enough space probes to say, you know what, maybe that Bible is right. And so with that, I'd like to just open it up to any questions that might have come up during this time.
How much time would it take for the short-range comets to come back to Earth that would freeze the mammoths?
Did you hear that?
I heard, how long would it take the short-term comets, and then I lost them?
To come back and freeze the frozen mammoths.
But it's not the comets that froze them. It was the water that didn't. See, the comets are made out of material that was ejected from the Earth at 7 miles a second, meaning it's never coming back to Earth. And they went off into orbits around the sun to become the comets and asteroids. The stuff that got ejected at less than 7 miles a second would have gone way up into space and come straight back down. And it would have come down as super cold, frozen water, carbon dioxide frozen into dry ice, and would have dumped and buried the mammoths. And Dr. Brown's mammoth chapter points out that the most famous mammoth, which was found that died standing up with broken ribs, broken legs, with no exterior impact, like nobody broke their legs with some kind of weapon to kill a mammoth. It died standing up with vegetation, temperate vegetation in its mouth and in its stomach. And it had to have frozen, and studies have been done to take an elephant-sized animal. How cold do you have to get the outside of its body to get it to freeze all the way into its internal organs to stop the digestive process and preserve those organs to keep them from rotting? And the answer is 150 degrees below zero, which really is best explained, despite what Mike Oort says, best explained by that stuff coming back from space and falling into an area and crushed them. See, he would have had his feet frozen by water that was already running from the rain, and then dry ice and super cold water comes down and instantly freezes his feet. He can't move as he's getting buried by a massive dump of ice and snow and dry ice, to the point where how many feet of crushing power, and he compresses his legs vertically to break his legs and some of his ribs. And then, so that would have been a temperate place. And then when the compression event happened, which is the continents moved away from the Atlantic ridge, the mass distribution of the earth changed, and that caused the earth to roll to where now a temperate latitude is brought up into the Arctic Circle. So those mammoths don't thaw back out and rot. This would have been happening all over the world. And in the places that it was, where the temperature wasn't preserved in cold, that snow and ice and dry ice would have melted away, and the mammoth would have rotted, leaving its bones as part of the record in the sedimentary layers. So, the ones that get buried and then the snow goes away, then it would have rotted instead of turning into a fossil record. So did that answer the question of whoever asked that?
Okay. I have a question. I'm sure Dr. Brown has done the calculations. When you think of all the comets don't have a lot of mass to them, the asteroids and then the trans-neptunian objects, I'm sure he's done the calculation. Does he find enough mass in that ejected matter to account for all those objects?
That's a really good answer, a good question. And that's the reason why Walt originally theorized that the original crust, pre-flood crust, was 10 miles thick and the subterranean chambers was below 10, was 10 miles below the crust. He did that because he knew how wide the erosion of the crack got before the mantle popped up into that area that's now, that mantle pop-up was what is now the mid-oceanic ridge. And so he knows that on the earth, there's an average mile thick of sedimentary rock on the earth. And so the 10 miles would have equated to that 1 mile thick of sedimentary rock. When he then realized, wow, everything they're finding about comets can be explained by material, not just, not material that just went up and came down and make sedimentary layers, but some material ejected from the earth with enough velocity to go become comets and asteroids. And so how much is that mass? That caused the mass to go to 60 miles, where even some of the bottom of that 60 miles that I had in that one slide I went over, the supercritical water would have dissolved a lot of that bottom part of the 60 miles. And that would have all crumbled away and gone up through the water, jettisoning up into space and gone into space too, to contribute to that mass. And it's really, it is hard for me too, to think, man, Pluto came from Earth, the 70,000 trans-Neptunian objects came from the Earth. But when, here in Washington, 2,000 feet of Mount St. Helens was pulverized in one big explosion. 2,000 feet of a mountain became ash all over the country, especially in Eastern Washington. And if that's just a small, think about a 40-some-thousand mile crack that has, 10, maybe 10, 20 miles of the bottom of the crust throughout the entire Earth going out, jettisoning up. And you have the side of the cracks jettisoning up. And all of that mass would explain the TNOs, even Pluto. And see, Pluto, they were shocked that Pluto has lakes of frozen carbon monoxide. How do you get carbon monoxide? Nitrogen, oxygen. The atmosphere of the Earth was jettisoned out too, and there's evidence that the atmospheric pressure of the Earth today is less than what it was at some time in the past. And regular evolutionary minded scientists have noticed it, because they go into what's the pressure that inside of amber and other things that have been found. And they say, hey, the atmosphere was higher. And that's why the dinosaurs really, the dinosaurs when they lived after the flood and reproduced, they had a hard time because one, there's not enough vegetation, and they don't have, it's like they, all of a sudden they're living up in the Alps instead of down at they get affected a lot more by being winded, by not having the same partial pressure of oxygen supplying their massive bodies. And so even the hydroplate theory explains why the atmospheric pressure is lower now than it was before. So,
Okay, I think we have another question from the floor. Go ahead.
okay.
My question is, when we look up at the moon with a telescope and we see all these craters, would you say that's the result of this debris flying up or later in time?
The
You know
craters
what?
on the moon.
Yeah, the craters on the moon. Okay, can I share screen again?
Sure.
All right. Oh, let's see. Just a second here. You can't see this, right?
Not yet.
Okay. Are you showing? You're going to share screen with me, or let me share screen? Hello?
I think you have the. I think you have the right to do it. Yeah, you're still co-host. So just share.
Okay, so I can do it. Okay. All right. I'm going to share it now. And then I'm going to go from current slide. Okay, does everybody see this?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is an animation from Brian Nickel. This is the Earth spinning out, throwing out debris. There's an astronomy professor from the Air Force Academy that has run the numbers of how much debris would it have taken to alter the moon's orbit, to put it slightly out of a perfectly circular 30-day orbit. See, right now, the Earth and the moon relationship is not very good for calendar evaluation, but God said he put it up there for using times and seasons and days. And so the moon was impacted by material that was jettisoned from the Earth. And then what happened, and there's the next slide here. See, it goes like this, bam. And when you look at the face of the moon, on our side, we see that face of the moon. Those are what's called mascons. They're mass concentrations of massive impacts that put extra mass into those craters that then volcanically flowed out and kind of smoothed out the moon. On the backside of the moon, there's no mascons, but there's thousands of smaller craters that were created by the impact of the debris coming from Earth. And when I showed the earlier one, it was running into it in the direction it was traveling, but now it's faced towards us, because just like if you had a wheel of a bicycle in your garage hanging up in the axle, if you stuck a weight on the 90-degree, what's going to happen? That weight is going to want to come down and face towards your garage floor, which in our case is the Earth. And Bob Enyart pointed out, he did more research on this than I did, but the moon is still so slightly rocking back and forth, indicating exactly what this animation by Brian Nickel demonstrates, that at first it would have been rocking and then gone to the other side, rock back. And so now the face that's pointing to us looks steady, but it rocks ever so slightly. So thank you, Brian Nickel, again for.
Follow up. Oh, go ahead. Another question. Yeah.
Sure, I've got one more question. This really makes the flood sound much more violent. What was it like in the Ark during this time?
Because of how violent, are you asking because of how violent all of this is, how did that affect the Ark? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, the structure of the Ark, and it sounds like it would have been colder as well. I never thought of this.
Yeah, I think that, again, a lot of it would have been complete. When you look at the sedimentary layers, this stuff was accelerated from 0 to, in some cases, 7 miles per second that goes up into space. But in others, less than that, it would have had a pulverizing effect. And the sun material layers of the earth is mostly just pulverized dirt that then solidified with the calcium carbonate, explained again by the hydroplate theory and not by other people, because where did all the calcium carbonate come from? But certainly there would have been rocks falling down on Earth that didn't get high enough velocity to go into space. And they all missed the ark, obviously. Or, you know, Noah probably was told to make the roof really strong. But we know they lived. In fact, I say to people, you know, what's really amazing to me is those 8 people lived through this. It is amazing that they did. And God could have easily kept them from being in a debris field that would have taken out the ship, taken out the boat, I should say. The barge.
With the Earth losing that mass, it's going to be like a skater spinning, pulling arms in and spinning faster. So is there
yeah.
evidence that the Earth's spin was slower before the flood?
And the answer to that is yes, explained by the hydroplate and only by the hydroplate theory too, because ancient calendars, and Bob Enyart did more work on this. And so again, I haven't published much of this stuff, but Bob Enyart has really got had a great website in kgov.com. But ancient calendar, I mean, there's ancient historical documents that after Noah and his sons landed, what do they have to do? They have to, besides growing vineyards to get drunk, they also would have been growing crops. And they would have been used to a 360-day year and a 30-day month by the times and seasons of the lesser and lighter lights of the day, because that's what God said on the creation week before the fall of man and before the judgment of Noah. And they would have realized, wow, our calendar's messed up because we try and grow when we used to grow, and now it's different. And so that's why there was so much ancient, you know, Stonehenges and certain temples in Egypt and everything that were all, people were wanting to know what is going on with our solar system, with our calendar. And so, yes, the Earth, two things spun up the Earth to make it 365 days. One is the jettisoning material. So the mass is now, I mean, it's closer to a center, but more important than that, and Walt has worked the numbers, the radius of the Earth shrunk by 180 miles as a result of the melting of the inner Earth. The created Earth had no liquid core, had no solid core in the center, liquid core around that, inner and outer core. It was all just a solid mass of Earth. The liquid core is a result of the melting of the inner Earth. When the mantle moved up in the Atlantic, that movement came from all through the Earth. That's what sucked down the Pacific crust, which is now buried under the magma of the Pacific floor. It sucked down that crust, which made the 40,000 volcanoes on the Western Pacific. And so it melted the inner Earth, and it was a runaway melt. And that shrunk the Earth, which in some place in Benioff zones gives it the appearance of subduction, when it was actually just a shrinking Earth, just like an orange or an apple that's dried out shrinks and its crust, the crust of the outside of an apple shrivels up, and the Earth spun faster. So we're messed up on our lunar month, and we're messed up on our annual year by the 360 becoming 365. Explained by the hydroplate theory. Strong evidence that calendar changed. What could cause the calendar to change? The only thing is conservation of angular momentum. The Earth sucks its mass in towards the center, which it did by the melting of the inner Earth.
Is there one last question? Well, thank you, Mr. Lee. This was a wonderful presentation, and you made reference to subduction, and some in the audience are aware of competing models of the flood and of continental movement, the catastrophic plate theory and the hydroplate theory. You know, some people say, well, creationists, they don't do science because they just say, well, God did it. No, they're, you know, the questions are how did these processes go? And scientists have been doing a lot of work on this. The evolutionists don't call it science because it disagrees, but their problem is they don't go with the data. They go with their preconceived notions. But this was a wonderful presentation. We thank you very much and thank everybody who tuned in and is here.
You know, Ross?
Yes. Yes.
Somebody just asked what I think is everybody would like to hear the answer to the question. And it's a short one. Like, what's the margin of error on that comet or that asteroid that's going to miss us by 20,000 miles? And, you know, this could be something, this asteroid actually could, some people speculate, it could actually be, they're not telling us the truth. Something happens and it's going to hit us, and it could be the prophetic one of Revelation. I don't know. But the astronomers really do have a very good knowledge of where the mass in the solar system is. And they can pretty accurately predict how close, but we're talking 20,000 miles. That is clipping your hair on your head. Now, if somebody has a gun and they're really a good shot and they promise me that this is dialed in and it's going to only hit my hair, what I'm really hoping is there's not a single breeze of wind that moves it towards my head. And so if there is some mass that could affect it ever so slightly, then it could, depending on which way that mass would move the asteroid, it could hit the Earth. And so, yeah, I don't suspect we'll be around here for it. And even if we are, we don't have to care about it because our life is hidden in Jesus. So can we close in prayer, Ross?
Do that.
Yeah, Father, I just thank you for this time. God, I do pray that everybody in the audience, and I know there's different views of how all this happened, Lord, and I just, God, you know, my bias is your word, and that every view that's contrary to what you have said in your scripture, I just pray, Lord Jesus, that you would help the Christian apologetic movement be first of all loyal to your word, God. And to the extent that we are all trying to find truth and even try to understand exactly what your word says, and we can fail in many different ways, Lord, and I could have failed in today communicating something because I'm just ignorant. And I just pray that you would wipe that out and get it replaced with something that's truth by further investigation of those that seek the truth, Lord. And I just pray otherwise, though, that we would all have our faith in you, that we would trust in you as our Savior, because you came to make a way for us to get off of this planet that is headed irrefutably to judgment. And God, that you took our judgment upon your Son, Jesus, that we could be forgiven and receive your righteousness and have everlasting life. And I thank you for that promise, Lord. And we trust in you. In Jesus' name, amen.